Come with me, the little black girl said. The billionaire was speechless when he heard it. Richard was a man who had everything the world could offer: wealth, power, influence, and recognition. People knew him as the billionaire who built one of the largest companies in the country, someone who rarely smiled and often appeared cold in the eyes of the public. To many, he was a figure untouchable, someone living far above the problems of ordinary life. Yet deep inside, Richard often felt an emptiness that even his billions could not fill. He attended meetings, signed deals, and managed empires, but every night, when he was alone in his penthouse, there was a silence that reminded him that something was missing. He didn't know what that something was, but it haunted him all the same. One late afternoon, after a long and exhausting board meeting, Richard decided to take a walk instead of being driven home. His drivers and assistants were surprised. He rarely broke his routine. But he wanted to feel the fresh air, to step away from the endless line of luxury cars and crowded offices. The park near the company headquarters was quiet at that hour. The leaves rustled softly in the breeze, and the sound of children playing in the distance reached his ears faintly. For once, he didn't want to think about business, stocks, or investments. He just wanted to clear his mind. As he walked along the winding path of the park, Richard noticed a little girl sitting alone on a bench. She looked no older than 7 or 8. Her skin was dark, her hair tied into 2 small braids, and she wore a simple dress that had seen better days. In her arms, she held a worn teddy bear, its fur faded from years of love. She wasn't crying, but there was a sadness in her eyes that immediately caught his attention. Children usually laughed, ran, and shouted in parks, but this one sat quietly, her gaze thoughtful as if the world weighed heavily on her small shoulders. Richard slowed his pace. He didn't usually stop for strangers, and certainly not for children he didn't know, but something about her presence made him pause. The girl looked up at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no fear in her look, no hesitation. Instead, there was a calm confidence, as if she knew him in a way others didn't. And then, in a voice that was soft but steady, she said 4 words that would change everything: "Come with me." Richard froze. He was not used to being spoken to like that, especially by a child. Most people approached him nervously, with hesitation or with clear motives. They either wanted his money, his approval, or his influence. But this girl had none of that in her eyes. She wasn't asking for anything, she was simply inviting him. It was strange, almost unsettling, yet strangely compelling. "Why?" Richard asked before he could stop himself. He almost laughed at how absurd it felt, standing in a quiet park, questioning a little girl about why he should follow her. But her response was simple. She hugged her teddy bear closer, tilted her head, and said, "You'll see." There was something in her voice that stirred him. He told himself he should walk away. He was a busy man, after all. He had meetings, schedules, and responsibilities. What could possibly come out of following a child he didn't even know? Yet, his feet betrayed him. Against all logic, he found himself taking a step toward her, then another. Before he realized it, he was walking beside her as she held her teddy bear tightly and led him away from the park. The streets they entered were narrow and far less polished than the areas Richard was used to. The buildings were older, their paint peeling, and the sidewalks cracked. He noticed how carefully the girl walked, as if she knew every corner and every step by heart. Richard, in his expensive suit and polished shoes, felt strangely out of place. People passing by glanced at him curiously, some recognizing him instantly, others simply noticing the odd pair they made: a billionaire in tailored clothes following a little girl with a teddy bear. He thought of asking her where they were going, but each time he looked at her, he decided against it. She walked with such purpose that he felt almost embarrassed to interrupt. For once, Richard wasn't leading, he was following. It was an unusual feeling for him, and oddly, he didn't hate it. After several minutes, they reached a small, run-down apartment building. Its walls were cracked, and the stair railings were rusted. The girl pushed open the heavy door with effort and turned back to make sure Richard was still following. Her eyes met his again, and she gave a small, reassuring nod. Without saying a word, she climbed the narrow stairs, her small feet moving quickly. Richard followed, his polished shoes echoing against the worn-out steps. They stopped at the third floor in front of a faded door. The girl gently knocked before pushing it open. Inside, Richard saw a tiny apartment, modest and clearly aged. The furniture was mismatched, the curtains thin, and the paint on the walls chipped. Yet, despite its worn-out state, the place radiated a warmth he hadn't expected. Drawings were taped to the walls, bright scribbles of houses, suns, and smiling faces. The smell of simple homemade soup drifted from the kitchen. It wasn't luxury, but it was home. Sitting on a small couch was a woman, her mother. She looked tired, her face pale, but her eyes carried the same quiet strength as her daughter's. When she saw Richard, she seemed surprised, even confused. But before she could speak, the girl ran to her side, placed the teddy bear down, and whispered something in her ear. The woman's eyes softened, and she offered Richard a weak but sincere smile. In that moment, Richard felt something shift inside him. He had walked into countless offices filled with power and luxury, but never into a place like this. It wasn't the furniture, the size, or the wealth of the home, it was the love and care that lived within its walls. And he, a man with more riches than he could ever use, felt strangely poor compared to the richness of spirit he saw before him. The little girl turned back to him and said again, more gently this time, "Come with me." Only then did Richard realize she hadn't just been asking him to follow her to a building. She had been inviting him into her world, a world he had never seen, one filled with lessons he had yet to understand. Richard stood there quietly, unsure of what to say. For the first time in years, he was speechless. Richard stood silently inside the small apartment, unsure of what to do next. He felt like a visitor in another world, a world that seemed so far from his own, yet strangely closer to something he had been missing for a long time. The little girl moved quickly, setting her teddy bear on the couch and then helping her mother sit more comfortably. Richard noticed how gently she held her mother's hand, how carefully she tucked a blanket around her, even though it was not cold. It was an instinctive care, the kind of love that came from practice, from doing it every day. Richard cleared his throat softly, feeling out of place. He was used to grand boardrooms, offices with high ceilings and glass walls, not a room with old curtains and drawings taped to chipped paint. But here, everything felt alive in a way his world didn't. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the woman looked at him and said with a tired smile, "Thank you for walking her home." Her voice was soft but steady, carrying both gratitude and exhaustion. Richard nodded, though he knew he hadn't done much at all. It was the girl who had led him. He was the one who had followed. The little girl came closer, her small hands holding a chipped glass of water, which she offered to him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He took it, more out of respect than thirst. The water was plain, but in that moment, it felt more valuable than the sparkling bottles that filled his penthouse fridge. He drank slowly, watching as the girl returned to sit near her mother. The room was quiet for a moment. Richard wanted to ask questions, but he didn't want to sound intrusive. Still, curiosity tugged at him. Finally, he asked gently, "What's your name?" The girl looked at him, her big eyes bright despite the weariness in her small frame. "Maya," she said simply. "And you?" he asked, turning to her mother. "Angela," she replied with a faint smile. I'm sorry for the state of things. We don't usually have visitors." Richard shook his head. "You don't have to apologize." He meant it. For some reason, he felt honored to be allowed into this small corner of their lives. Angela adjusted her seat, and Richard noticed how her movements were slow, as though every step cost her strength. Maya immediately placed her hand on her mother's arm, her little face filled with worry. Richard could see it clearly now: the woman was unwell. He had seen sickness before, but only from a distance, in hospitals he visited for charity events or health programs his company sponsored. Never this close. Never in a home where a child had to grow up faster than her years. Angela seemed to notice his gaze, and without bitterness, she explained, "I've been unwell for some time. It makes things difficult. But Maya, she helps me more than I could ever ask." She looked at her daughter with pride, her tired eyes glowing. "She is stronger than she knows." Maya leaned her head against her mother's arm. "I told you I can take care of us," she said softly, with a kind of seriousness that didn't belong to a child her age. Richard felt his chest tighten. Here was a little girl, who should be laughing and running in parks, instead speaking like an adult, carrying burdens too heavy for her small shoulders. And yet, there was no bitterness in her voice, only determination. He sat down slowly on the edge of the worn-out chair, his expensive suit feeling completely out of place in the room. He found himself asking, almost without thinking, "What do you usually do after school, Maya?" She looked up at him, surprised by the question. "I come straight home," she said. "I cook sometimes, and I clean. Then I read to Mama, and we eat together." She paused, hugging her teddy bear. "I don't play much outside. I like to be with her." Richard nodded, trying to process her words. He thought of children he saw at charity galas dressed in fancy clothes, playing with expensive toys, laughing freely. And then he looked at Maya, who found her joy in caring for her mother, in simple routines that most people would overlook. Angela smiled faintly, her voice carrying quiet dignity. "She doesn't complain. She never asks for more than we can give. That's her way." Richard leaned back, his mind spinning. He had spent his whole life chasing bigger deals, larger profits, new ventures. Yet here was a little girl who had more strength in her heart than many grown adults he knew. She didn't chase wealth, she created love out of what little she had. The minutes stretched into hours. Richard stayed longer than he had intended, listening as Angela shared stories of how they had managed over the years. She had once worked at a small library, surrounded by books, until her illness forced her to stop. Maya had grown up among shelves of stories, listening to her mother read tales of faraway lands. That was where her imagination bloomed, where she learned that even in a small world, dreams could be large. Richard found himself smiling genuinely, something he hadn't done in a long time. He asked Maya about her favorite story, and she quickly answered, "The one where the hero doesn't give up, no matter how hard things get." She spoke about it with such passion that Richard felt a spark light inside him. As evening settled, Richard realized he didn't want to leave. Something about this small apartment, this child and her mother, felt more real than anything he had known in years. He noticed that even though their lives were hard, there was no emptiness in their home. Instead, there was warmth, love, and courage. When he finally stood to leave, Maya walked him to the door. She looked up at him with those same clear eyes she had in the park and whispered, "I told you to come with me. Now you see." Richard didn't know what to say. For the second time that day, he was speechless. All he could do was nod. As he stepped into the cool night air, Richard realized that his world had shifted. He couldn't explain it yet, but he knew he would return. Something inside him needed to. That night, when he lay in his grand penthouse, surrounded by luxury, he felt a difference. The silence that usually pressed down on him was still there, but it didn't feel the same. Instead of loneliness, there was a memory: Maya's determined little voice, her mother's soft smile, the warmth of their small home. And for the first time in years, Richard felt the faint beginning of something he had lost long ago, Hope. The following days were unlike anything Richard had experienced in years. His life had always been governed by schedules, reminders, and constant phone calls. But now, in the back of his mind, there was always the memory of Maya's eyes and her mother's smile. He found himself thinking about them during meetings, in the middle of business calls, even while reviewing reports. He tried to focus on the numbers and the plans his managers presented, but their voices faded, replaced by the echo of a little girl saying, "Come with me." Richard didn't tell anyone where he had gone that day or why he felt so restless afterward. His assistants noticed a change in him, though. He was quieter, less sharp with his words, more distracted. One evening, after another long day of business, he decided to do something unusual for him. He returned to the small apartment building. The streets were the same, the buildings still cracked, but this time he didn't feel like a stranger walking out of place. He felt as though something in this neighborhood was waiting for him. When he reached the familiar door, he hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should knock. He wasn't used to appearing uninvited at anyone's home. In his world, appointments had to be scheduled weeks in advance. But before he could make up his mind, the door opened, and Maya stood there, her teddy bear clutched tightly in one hand. Her face lit up with a smile when she saw him. "You came back," she said simply, as though she had always known he would. Richard felt an odd warmth in his chest. "Yes," he said softly, almost embarrassed by how relieved he felt. She pulled the door open wider. "Mama will be happy." Inside, the little apartment looked the same, humble and warm. Angela sat on the couch, a blanket over her legs, her eyes tired but welcoming. She smiled when she saw him. "I didn't expect you," she said kindly. "I hope I'm not intruding," Richard replied, feeling strangely like a boy asking permission. "Not at all," Angela assured him. "Please, sit." He sat down in the same chair as before, and Maya quickly brought him a glass of water again, as if it were now her personal duty. He accepted it gratefully, realizing that the simple gesture meant more to him than the finest wine served at his business dinners. This time, the conversation flowed more easily. Angela shared small details about their daily life, about how Maya loved to draw pictures of houses with big gardens, about how she dreamed of becoming a teacher one day. Richard listened closely, more closely than he had ever listened to anyone in years. Every word felt important, every small detail precious. At one point, Maya pulled out a stack of her drawings and showed them to him. The pages were filled with colorful sketches, families standing in front of houses, children holding hands, suns shining brightly in the sky. Richard studied each one as though they were priceless works of art. He noticed that in many of them, there was always a man standing near the little girl and her mother. The man was tall, drawn in simple lines, but always present, always watching over them. "Who is he?" Richard asked gently. Maya hesitated for a moment, then said quietly, "I don't know. Maybe someone who takes care of us." She looked up at him then, her eyes steady and serious. "Maybe you." Richard felt his throat tighten. He wasn't sure how to respond. For years, he had built walls around his heart, convincing himself that money and success were enough. Yet here was a child, in her innocent honesty, showing him a place where he might belong. Angela, noticing his silence, spoke softly. "Children see things in ways we don't. Maya believes people come into our lives for reasons." Richard nodded slowly, still looking at the drawings. "Maybe she's right," he said, though his voice was almost a whisper. That evening stretched into one of the most meaningful nights Richard had known. They ate a simple meal together, soup with bread, and for the first time in years, Richard felt that he was part of a family table. The food was plain, but it carried a flavor no luxury restaurant could offer. It was flavored with love, care, and togetherness. Later, as Angela grew tired, Maya asked if she could read a story aloud, something they often did before bedtime. She chose a book with torn pages and a faded cover, and she began reading with a clear, strong voice. Richard listened, captivated not so much by the story itself but by the way she read, the way her small voice filled the room with life. Every word seemed to carry hope, every sentence a promise that tomorrow could be better. When the story ended, Maya leaned against her mother, her eyelids heavy with sleep. Richard stood quietly, not wanting to disturb the moment. As he moved toward the door, Angela looked at him and said, "You remind me of someone I once knew, someone who believed that kindness could change the world." Richard paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I'm not sure I've ever believed that," he admitted honestly. Angela smiled gently. "Maybe you just needed someone to remind you." Those words stayed with him long after he left the apartment. As he drove back to his world of glass towers and shining lights, he felt as though he had been given a gift, something he couldn't quite name. He thought about Maya's words, her drawings, the way she had looked at him with trust. He thought about Angela's strength, her quiet dignity despite her illness. The next morning, Richard arrived at his office as usual, but everything looked different. The polished desks, the expensive suits, the endless reports, all of it seemed shallow compared to what he had experienced the night before. His colleagues noticed his distraction, but none dared to question him. Richard had always been a man who kept his thoughts to himself. For the first time, however, he didn't want to keep them to himself. He wanted to return to that little apartment, to sit in that small living room filled with drawings, to hear Maya's laughter, to listen to Angela's gentle words. He wanted to feel human again, something he realized he had almost forgotten how to be. That evening, he went back again. This time, he brought books for Maya, carefully chosen stories he hoped she would love. Her eyes lit up when she saw them, and she hugged him with such sincerity that Richard felt something break open inside his chest. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was simply kindness, but it felt more valuable than any deal he had ever signed. Angela thanked him, her voice filled with emotion. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," Richard replied. "But I want to." As he sat with them again, Richard realized that his life was changing. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was becoming part of their story. And though he couldn't explain it, he knew that this was only the beginning of something much greater than himself. Richard's life began to take a turn he never imagined. What started as a single walk in the park had now become a part of his routine. After long hours of meetings and decisions, instead of heading to his penthouse or a dinner with wealthy associates, he found himself drawn back to the small apartment where Maya and her mother lived. Each visit felt like stepping into another world, a world that was simple yet so much richer than the one filled with money and power. At first, he thought his visits might be short-lived, a passing curiosity. But as days turned into weeks, he realized that something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt restless in the quiet. He no longer dreaded the silence of his thoughts. In fact, he began to look forward to the evenings when he would sit at that little table, eat simple food, and listen to Maya's stories. Angela noticed the change in him too. One evening, after Maya had gone to her room to work on her drawings, Angela looked at Richard with a thoughtful smile. "You've changed," she said softly. Richard raised his brows slightly, almost amused. "Changed? How?" "You smile more now," she answered. "You listen with your heart, not just your ears. And I can tell you don't carry the same emptiness in your eyes as the first time you walked in here." Her words touched him more deeply than he expected. For years, he had heard compliments from business leaders, praises for his success, and recognition for his achievements. Yet none of those words had ever felt as true or as meaningful as Angela's simple observation. Maya, with her endless energy, continued to surprise him every time. She often pulled him into her little world of imagination. Sometimes she asked him to sit on the floor with her as she showed him her newest drawings. Other times she insisted he read stories aloud, even laughing when he struggled to give each character a different voice. Richard found himself doing things he had never thought he would, like balancing crayons on his fingers or helping Maya build small houses out of cardboard boxes. These moments, though simple, gave him more joy than any luxury event ever had. But Richard was not blind to the struggles inside the home. Angela's illness often kept her weak, and though she tried to hide it, Richard could see the strain in her movements. He noticed how she sometimes pressed her hand against her side, or how her breathing became heavy after climbing the stairs. Maya noticed too, though she rarely spoke about it. She simply adjusted, helping her mother with quiet determination. One evening, as Maya was busy coloring, Richard spoke gently to Angela. "You shouldn't have to carry this burden alone," he said. "There are ways to get better help." Angela shook her head softly. "Doctors, medicine, treatments, it all costs more than we can manage. I don't like asking for help." Richard leaned forward, his eyes steady. "You don't have to ask. Let me do this, not as charity, but because I want to." Angela looked at him carefully, her expression unreadable. She was a proud woman, one who didn't want to depend on others. But she also knew that Maya deserved stability, that her daughter deserved a life where she could focus on being a child rather than worrying about adult problems. After a long pause, she nodded. "If it helps Maya, then I'll accept." That very week, Richard quietly arranged everything. He called the best doctors, arranged appointments, and made sure Angela received proper medical attention. He never made a show of it, never spoke about the money he was spending. Instead, he simply appeared at the appointments, sitting patiently in waiting rooms beside Maya, who held his hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. During those visits, he discovered another side of himself: patience. The man who had once been known for rushing through meetings and demanding quick answers now found peace in waiting. It didn't matter if hours passed. As long as he was there with Maya and Angela, time felt different. Slowly, Angela's health began to improve. Her strength returned little by little, and her smile grew brighter each day. She still had difficult moments, but the difference was visible. Maya noticed it immediately, often running to her mother after school, excited to see her standing taller, her voice stronger. One evening, after a checkup, Maya tugged on Richard's sleeve. "You helped Mama get better," she said, her voice full of pride. Richard knelt to her level and shook his head gently. "Your mama is strong. She's the one getting better. I just helped a little." Maya grinned. "But you stayed. That's what matters." Those words echoed in Richard's heart long after. He realized she was right. Money could buy medicine, doctors, and comfort, but it was presence, consistency, and care that built trust. For years, he had thought that money was the only solution to problems. But Maya had taught him something far greater: sometimes, the most valuable gift was simply being there. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Richard was no longer just a visitor, he had become a part of their small family circle. He joined them for dinners, helped Maya with her school projects, and listened to Angela's quiet wisdom. In return, they gave him something he hadn't realized he needed: belonging. But this transformation did not go unnoticed in Richard's other world. His business associates began whispering about his absences, wondering why he seemed less interested in the constant chase for more. His assistants were confused when he canceled dinner meetings or postponed late-night calls. Some even speculated that he was hiding something. Richard didn't care. For the first time, he felt free. He still managed his company with the same sharp mind, but his heart was no longer chained only to profits. When he looked at his calendar, the meetings that mattered most were not with investors or board members, but with a little girl holding a teddy bear and a mother who had taught him more about strength than anyone else. One night, as they sat together after dinner, Maya pulled out her stack of drawings again. She had drawn another picture of her family, but this time, the man beside her and her mother was drawn with more detail. He had a kind face, a tall frame, and a hand reaching out to hold theirs. She showed it to Richard proudly and said, "See? You're in it now." Richard stared at the drawing, his throat tight with emotion. "Am I?" he asked softly. Maya nodded with certainty. "Yes. You're part of us now." Angela, sitting nearby, looked at him with eyes full of gratitude. "She's right," she whispered. Richard didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded, holding the drawing close, realizing that in this small apartment, in this unexpected bond, he had found something money could never buy. A family. Months passed, and the rhythm of Richard's life was no longer the same. His days still began with business meetings and ended with boardroom decisions, but the evenings belonged to something far more important. When the sun went down, his heart pulled him toward the little apartment where laughter, warmth, and love replaced the endless chase of money and numbers. Angela's health continued to improve with the care and support Richard had arranged. She was no longer confined by weakness as before, and though she still had her quiet days, she now walked with more energy, her face glowing with renewed life. Maya, meanwhile, blossomed like a flower in spring. Her schoolwork improved, her confidence grew, and her imagination seemed to have no limits. Each new drawing she made, each story she read aloud, was brighter than the last. Richard noticed how the little girl's joy seemed to spread into him as well. The man who had once been called cold and distant by the world was now someone who laughed openly at her jokes, who clapped proudly when she showed him her school grades, who sat patiently as she braided his hair with ribbons for fun. To the outside world, he was still the billionaire with power and status, but in that apartment, he was simply Mr. Richard, the man who read bedtime stories and carried grocery bags up the stairs. One evening, Richard received an invitation to speak at a charity gala. These were events he had attended countless times, often giving the same polished speeches about growth, numbers, and opportunities. But this time felt different. As he stood on the stage before the wealthy audience, he found himself telling a story he had never planned to share. He spoke about how, months ago, he had felt a hollowness in his life, a silence that money could not fill. He told them about walking in a park one afternoon and meeting a little girl who had looked at him with eyes far wiser than her age. He repeated the words she had said to him, "Come with me." He explained how those simple words had led him into a world of courage, resilience, and love, one that had changed him more than any business venture ever could. The room grew silent as he spoke, every guest leaning forward to listen. Richard admitted something that shocked many of them, that for all his wealth, he had only recently discovered the true meaning of richness. "It is not in the numbers in your bank account," he said softly, his voice steady. "It is in the lives you touch, the hands you hold, the kindness you give." When he stepped off the stage, there was no applause at first, just a heavy silence filled with reflection. Then the clapping began, slow at first, then growing stronger until the entire room echoed with it. But Richard wasn't thinking about the applause. He was thinking about Maya and Angela, and how they had unknowingly given him the greatest lesson of his life. That night, when he returned to the apartment, Maya ran to him with her teddy bear. "How was it?" she asked eagerly. Richard knelt and hugged her tightly. "It was good," he whispered. "But do you know what made it truly special?" She shook her head, her braids swinging. "You," he said, tapping her nose gently. "Because everything I said tonight started with you." Her smile was so wide that it lit up the entire room. Angela, standing nearby, had tears in her eyes, though they were tears of joy. "You've given us so much," she said softly. Richard shook his head firmly. "No. You gave me more. You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." The days that followed continued to weave their lives together. Richard became a constant presence, no longer a visitor but a part of their family. He helped Angela with errands, supported Maya's schooling, and filled their home with small acts of care. And in return, they filled his life with love and belonging. One Saturday afternoon, Maya asked Richard to walk with her to the park, the same park where they had first met. She held his hand as they strolled, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. The sun was shining, and children's laughter filled the air. They sat together on the same bench where she had once sat alone. "Do you remember?" Maya asked, her voice curious. Richard smiled. "I remember everything. You said, 'Come with me.'" She nodded proudly. "And you did." "Yes," Richard said, his eyes soft. "And it was the best decision I ever made." They sat in silence for a while, watching the children play. For Richard, the world no longer seemed as empty as before. In that moment, he realized how far he had come from a man with everything but nothing, to a man who had found everything he had been missing. As the sun dipped lower, Maya leaned against him and whispered, "You're not lonely anymore, are you?" Richard wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "No," he said quietly. "Because I have you." When they returned to the apartment, Angela welcomed them with dinner already on the table. They ate together, laughing at Maya's stories about her day. Later, when it was time for bed, Richard read her a story as he always did. When she finally drifted off to sleep, her small hand still holding his, Angela whispered, "You've become family to us, Richard." He looked at her, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And you've become mine." That night, as he left the apartment, Richard looked up at the stars. He thought about the empire he had built, the towers that bore his name, the wealth that newspapers admired. But none of it compared to what he had now, a place where he was needed, where he was loved, where he truly belonged. The words that had once seemed so simple now carried a lifetime of meaning. "Come with me." A child's invitation had opened a door to a world he never knew he needed, and he had walked through it. In doing so, he had discovered the truest form of wealth, love, family, and the courage to share life with others. And so, the man who once stood alone in the silence of his penthouse was no longer lonely. He was a part of something real, something lasting. All because a little girl had believed enough to reach out her hand and ask him to follow.